Every genre has a moment before it was a genre, a single game that assembled the right pieces in the right order and made something that didn't have a name yet. These games created those moments. Some of them created genres that now generate billions of dollars annually. Some of them created genres that are still niche. All of them looked at what games were and decided to do something that games weren't. Metroid arrived on the Famicom Disk System in 1986 and established the design language that the Metroidvania genre would spend the next 4 decades developing. An interconnected world rather than discrete levels. Abilities that serve as keys for areas locked behind environmental requirements. A map that reveals itself through exploration rather than being provided at the start. The principle that backtracking with new capabilities should reveal the world rather than just repeat it. None of these ideas existed in combination before Metroid put them together, and together they constitute one of the most influential design philosophies in games. Samus's movement abilities and the way they interact with the environment were carefully enough conceived that players still find new uses for them in the original game. Wall jumping in a game that doesn't explicitly teach wall jumping, sequence-breaking routes that the designers clearly planned for without telegraphing. The game trusted players to discover what its systems could do rather than explaining every possibility, which created the exploratory relationship between player and game world that defines the genre. Super Metroid in 1994 refined everything the original established to the point where it became the genre's defining text rather than just its origin point. But the design philosophy, the sense that the world itself is the puzzle, that your movement options are the tools, and that the map is a record of what you've already figured out, that was present and functional in 1986. Super Metroid made it beautiful. Metroid made it possible. Doom arrived in 1993 as shareware distributed through early internet channels and transformed the first-person perspective from a technical curiosity into the dominant lens of action gaming for the next 3 decades. id Software had made Wolfenstein 3D the year before, which proved the concept, but Doom refined it into something that looked, moved, and felt like a genre rather than an experiment. Variable height environments, outdoor spaces, lighting that created atmosphere rather than just visibility, enemy designs with behavior patterns rather than just movement paths. Doom was doing things that Wolfenstein hadn't attempted. The level design is what made it a genre template rather than just a successful game. Carmack's rendering engine and Romero's map design worked together to produce spaces that were readable during combat, memorable after a session, and replayable once you knew them. The secret areas rewarded attention. The non-linear level layouts meant that fights approached from different directions produced different results. The shotgun's kick, the chainsaw sound, the BFG's charge. Every weapon had a feel that made the act of using it satisfying independent of what it was pointed at. Doom also created the modding community that would eventually produce Counter-Strike, Team Fortress, and the entire ecosystem of user-created content that defines online gaming today. The WAD file format that let players build and share their own levels was a design decision that Romero and Carmack made deliberately, and the community that built around it had more long-term influence on the industry than the game itself. The original Metal Gear on the MSX2 in 1987 made the argument that the most interesting thing a player could do in an action game was avoid the action, sneaking past guards rather than engaging them, using the environment to create safe paths through hostile space, treating detection as failure rather than as the beginning of a combat sequence. These were design positions that contradicted everything the action game genre had established, and Hideo Kojima committed to them completely. The guard sight lines, the sound radius around player movement, the radio calls that summoned reinforcements. Metal Gear built an ecosystem of threat that required observation before engagement. You were gathering information about the patrol pattern before you moved, reading the geometry to find the shadows, timing your movement to the rhythm of what the guards were doing. That cognitive process, the stealth game is a puzzle where the solution changes if you're seen, became the template for Thief, Splinter Cell, Hitman, Dishonored, and every game since that treats silence as the primary skill. The NES port that most Western players encountered in the late 80s was a significantly compromised version of the original, which meant the genre it was creating didn't fully land in North America until Metal Gear Solid in 1998. By then, the design ideas from the MSX original had been refined across a decade of sequels, and what arrived on PlayStation was the fully realized version of what 1987 had sketched out. The gap between the sketch and the realization is worth understanding. Metal Gear invented stealth gaming in an era when almost no one played the game that proved it.
Yes, sir.
Dune 2: The Building of a Dynasty was released by Westwood Studios in 1992 and created real-time strategy as a genre fully formed. Base building, resource harvesting, unit production queues, technology trees, fog of war, and direct mouse-click control of individual units. All of it was here before Warcraft, before Command & Conquer, before StarCraft. Westwood would go on to make Command & Conquer themselves, which became the genre's defining franchise for years, and the through line from this game to that franchise to every RTS since is direct and documentable. The Dune license gave the game its setting, but the design didn't depend on familiarity with Herbert's novel. Three factions played differently enough that choosing between them was a meaningful decision, and the spice harvesting economy that drove everything else connected the resource management to the fiction in a way that felt thematically coherent rather than arbitrary. Fighting over spice in a game set in the Dune universe meant the mechanics were serving the story rather than existing alongside it. What's remarkable about Dune 2 in retrospect is how complete the template was on the first attempt. The games that followed it, and there were hundreds, refined the formula, added features, and scaled the scope, but they rarely changed what the genre fundamentally was. Westwood solved the basic design problem of real-time strategy so thoroughly in 1992 that the genre's evolution has been largely one of addition rather than reinvention. Super Mario 64 didn't just move Mario into 3 dimensions. It solved the problem of what 3D game design should actually be at a moment when everyone else was still guessing. The camera system, the analog stick movement, the way momentum builds and carries through jumps, the organization of a 3D space into discrete objectives rather than a single linear path. Nintendo had to invent all of it from scratch because there was no precedent to work from. What they produced in 1996 became the blueprint that the rest of the industry followed for the next decade. The triple jump, the long jump, the backflip, the wall kick. These weren't just moves, they were a vocabulary for 3-dimensional space that players had to learn and that the game's levels were designed to reward mastering. Finding that you could sequence break Bob-omb Battlefield by long jumping over a wall that was supposed to require a star you hadn't collected, yet was the game teaching you, through discovery, that its movement system had depth the surface didn't reveal. That relationship between player curiosity and mechanical reward is something the genre has been chasing ever since. The camera remains the thing that new players struggle with most, and by modern standards it requires patience. Nintendo was solving an unsolved problem with the hardware available in 1996, and the solution wasn't perfect. But the rest of the design was so ahead of what anyone else was doing that every 3D platformer that followed was working from notes Mario 64 had already written. Rogue was developed in 1980 by Michael Toy and Glenn Wichman on Unix systems and was never commercially released. It spread through university computer labs and early internet communities as freely shared software. What it contained was a dungeon-crawling RPG where every element was procedurally generated. The map layout, the item placement, the enemy distribution, and crucially, the identification of items, which were randomized each run so that a potion that healed in one game might poison in the next. Permanent death meant that every run was its own contained experience. The combination created infinite replayability from a program that fit on a floppy disk. The genre that now carries Rogue's name has fragmented into debates about what constitutes a true successor and what's merely roguelike inspired. Procedural generation, permanent death, and run-based structure are the features most games claim as their inheritance. The depth of that inheritance varies enormously. NetHack is a direct descendant. Hades borrows the structure while softening the permanence, and Vampire Survivors reduces the formula to its most elemental loop. All of them acknowledge the same origin. What Rogue understood before anyone had language to describe, it was that unpredictability was a feature rather than a limitation. In an era when games were valued for their handcrafted content, Rogue chose to generate its content procedurally and discovered that players preferred the variation. That preference, for games that can surprise you even after hundreds of hours, is the foundation of one of the most commercially vital genres in contemporary gaming. SimCity was released by Maxis in 1989 and created the city-building simulation genre by asking a question games hadn't previously considered worth asking. What if the goal was to build something rather than to win something? No lose condition, no antagonist, no externally imposed time limit, just a system of interacting variables representing a city and the player's choices about how to develop it. Well, Wright designed it after realizing that the simulation tool he'd built for another project was more interesting than the game it was made for. The underlying simulation, traffic flow, property values, tax revenue, industrial pollution, residential desirability, was complex enough that cities behave in ways that surprised experienced players. Placing an industrial zone upwind of a residential area degraded property values across a radius the game calculated rather than scripted. Building a highway through a neighborhood produced traffic patterns affecting commercial development in adjacent zones. The city wasn't responding to inputs according to fully predictable rules, which made the simulation feel alive in ways that more transparent systems don't produce. Every management and building simulation made since 1989 is a descendant of what SimCity established. The genre diversified into theme parks, hospitals, and medieval settlements. But the core loop, build a system, watch it run, identify its failures, intervene, was Will Wright's invention. SimCity also established that games could be about process rather than outcome, a design philosophy that eventually produced everything from The Sims to Dwarf Fortress. Pong was not the first video game. That conversation has a longer history, but it was the first to become a cultural phenomenon, and the design principles it embodied created the framework that competitive gaming has operated within ever since. 2 players, symmetrical conditions, a single objective, and a score that declared a winner without ambiguity. That clarity, the immediate legibility of who was winning and why, is the principle that separates competitive games from cooperative ones, and Pong articulated it with a simplicity that decades of design evolution haven't structurally improved on. The sports simulation lineage that runs from Pong through every subsequent sports game is the most direct inheritance. Atari's tennis and baseball games, then Tecno's Double Dribble, then EA Sports' entire catalog, all built on the foundational premise that athletic competition could be represented by abstracting its essential physics and rules into interactive systems. Pong's paddle and ball abstraction of tennis is crude by any later standard, but it's recognizable as the same genre as FIFA or NBA 2K in ways that most 1972 technology isn't recognizable as anything contemporary. What's easy to underestimate is the decision to make it 2-player by default at a time when games were understood as solitary experiences. Putting 2 people at the same machine, pointed at the same screen, in direct competition. That social configuration is what Pong introduced to public spaces. The arcade as a social environment, competitive gaming as a way to engage with strangers, the high score as a public record. All of it began here. Street Fighter II's genre-founding role deserves its own framing here. Before 1991, fighting games existed, but they existed as arcade novelties without the competitive infrastructure that defines the genre today. This created that infrastructure, the 6-button layout, the character specialization where each fighter plays by meaningfully different rules, the frame data precision that makes every interaction a product of specific decisions, and a tournament format that emerged organically from players who wanted to test their knowledge against each other. What this game established that hadn't existed before was the idea that a fighting game's depth should be discovered rather than explained. Nobody told players that Guile's Sonic Boom required a charge input or that Zangief's spinning piledriver had a specific grab range. They found it, shared it, and built a community around the finding. That community, that culture of discovery and competitive testing, is what the genre actually is underneath the character rosters and health bars. Every fighting game released since 1991, Mortal Kombat, Tekken, King of Fighters, Virtua Fighter, Guilty Gear, every one, made its first design decisions in response to what this established. Some of them tried to simplify it, some to deepen it, some to replace the 6-button layout entirely. None of them started from zero, because Street Fighter II had already defined what zero looked like and what it meant to move beyond it. Resident Evil didn't invent horror in games, but it invented survival horror as a specific design philosophy, where the horror comes not from jump scares or atmosphere alone, but from the mechanical experience of being underprepared. Limited inventory slots, finite ammunition, ink ribbons as save resources that themselves need to be rationed. Every system in the original 1996 game was engineered to produce the feeling of inadequacy. You never had quite enough of what you needed, and that scarcity was the source of the dread rather than any individual enemy or moment. The fixed camera angles that defined the original trilogy were both a visual choice and a game design one. They controlled information. You often heard something before you saw it, and the transition between camera positions created blind spots that the game exploited deliberately. Moving through a hallway you'd walked before while not being able to see what was waiting around the corner was a specific tension the camera produced that free camera survival horror has never quite replicated. The genre Resident Evil created has now produced decades of imitators, successors, and reinventions. Silent Hill, Amnesia, Outlast, and the Dead Space series all owe their existence to the template the original established. Even Resident Evil itself has reinvented that template multiple times across its own sequels, moving toward action in 4 and 5 and back towards something closer to the original philosophy in 7. The genre it built was resilient enough to survive the franchise that created it, repeatedly abandoning it. Grand Theft Auto 3 didn't invent the open world, but defined what an open world game should feel like to inhabit. Liberty City in 2001 wasn't just a large space with things in it. It was a place with systems that interacted with each other, a population that responded to what you did, and a criminal economy that gave player behavior meaning beyond level completion. The emergent storytelling that happened when you stole a car, attracted police attention, drove through a crowded street, and created a chain of events nobody scripted. That was the genre's founding experience, and GTA 3 delivered it at a scale and fidelity that made everything before it look like a prototype. The mission structure that interrupted the open-world experience with directed objectives was itself an innovation. Not an either-or between sandbox freedom and narrative progression, but a both, and where the city existed independently of the story, and the story used the city rather than replacing it. That structure, go anywhere between missions, do what the story asks when you choose to engage with it, became the template for every open-world game from Assassin's Creed to Red Dead Redemption to Spider-Man. The controversy at launch was real, and the design choices that generated it were deliberate. But separating the cultural noise from the design contribution reveals a game that solved the open-world problem so thoroughly that the genre it created has been the most commercially dominant in gaming for the past 20 years. The games that followed changed the content and the scale. The structure GTA 3 established has barely needed revision. Harappa the Rapper came out in Japan in 1996 and created the rhythm game as a genre built around player performance rather than just musical appreciation. The call and response mechanic. A character performs an action, you replicate it by pressing the right buttons in the right rhythm. Was deceptively simple and immediately accessible while having enough timing precision in its scoring system to reward genuine skill. The game understood that music becomes more engaging when you're participating rather than listening, and it built its entire design around making that participation feel like performance. The visual style and the music were inseparable from the genre argument the game was making. Masaki Yuasa's flat, layered paper art and the original hip-hop compositions weren't aesthetic decoration. They were demonstrations that rhythm game design worked best when the music and the visual presentation were created together rather than grafted onto each other. Every subsequent rhythm game, with ambitions beyond score chasing, has grappled with the same integration problem this solved on the first attempt. Guitar Hero, Rock Band, Dance Dance Revolution, Rhythm Heaven, Beat Saber. Every game that asks you to perform music rather than just play through it is working from what Parappa established. The specific input methods vary, the hardware requirements have changed dramatically, and the scale of what's possible has expanded enormously. The fundamental insight that the most satisfying way to engage with music in a game is to feel like you're making it was this game's, and it remains the genre's organizing principle.
Punch.